Good morning. Seemed to have trouble with the live feed again when we did the service, so I'm going to give it another try here with a little catch-up feed afterwards. Give you the scripture and the message at least so that we can have that. Just not sure what's going on. These have seemed to work, but our Sunday morning ones earlier in service just don't seem to be quite managing, so we've got to figure that out. I'm going to have to see how that all takes place. Anyway. The scripture that we used this morning was Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. It's the finish of our series in Ruth. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. And the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his fame be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." And Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. What I shared with the folks this morning during our Sunday morning service was that last week we saw how Boaz, acting in his role as the redeemer of the family of Elimelech, that's Naomi's husband, the man who passed away at the beginning of the story. He acted in his role as redeemer. Goel is the Hebrew word, if you remember that from last week. And through his actions, he bought the land that Elimelech had owned. He bought it, kept it in the family, and he also married Ruth, as we see here. And in so doing, he performed the duty of the Redeemer for the family. But redemption wasn't the end. Redemption wasn't the whole goal. There was something else that was supposed to happen afterwards. There was something else that still needed to happen afterwards. And we see that happen with the birth of Obed. Now, you remember that marriage is seen differently in this culture than it was seen in ours. And there's some things about Obed's birth that are important to remember and to point out. Although Obed was biologically the son of Ruth and Boaz, legally he was the son of Ruth's first husband, Mahlon. Now, Mahlon had died without having children, and so he had no heirs. And according to the law, called the law of the Levirate, when a member of the family married Ruth and they had a child, their first son was legally considered the heir to Mahlon. So, although this is biologically Boaz's son, legally he's Mahlon's son, which means he's Naomi's grandson. If you remember, when Naomi came back from Moab, she told the women who greeted her at the town not to call her Naomi anymore, the name that translates as pleasant. Call her instead Mara, which translates as bitter. She feels emptied out. Of course, there's the personal dimension of the loss of her husband and her sons. That's something that we can totally understand. It would be completely conceivable and translate across cultures. Somebody in the same situation today would have the same feelings. There's an additional dimension, though, for the culture of the time. And this is where some of our living in a different culture gives us gaps that we have to try to figure out how to cross and learn. And in this case, the additional factor was that if somebody passed away without inheritance, without descendants, they were considered to be, well, they were going to vanish. They just wouldn't exist anymore. Their name would disappear from history, from the story. It's one of the reasons why God's first promise to Abram and Sarai was that they would have descendants. And then later on, of course, there's Abraham and Sarah. They have Isaac. Abram had set up, legally, he says at one point, the heir to his house was a man named Eleazar of Damascus. And so he has a legal heir to all of his property. It's not as though it's just going to go out and get fought over or something like that. He's got a legal heir to all that. But in terms of his name, his family name, his presence, the line, his role in history, all that would disappear if he died without a descendant. So God promised him that. And that was the first promise that God fulfilled to him by giving him Isaac, who later on, of course, became the father of Jacob and Esau, but through Jacob, became the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, and so on and so forth until we get into the nation of Israel, where we are today, actually, in the story of Ruth. So when Obed is born, by being the legal son of Mahlon, he's the legal grandson of Naomi and Elimelech, and the line has been restored. See, what Naomi faced when she came back was not simply the personal tragedy of the loss of her husband and sons, but the realization that they would disappear now, as though they had never existed. And this, to us, might seem a little, that's not exactly how we'd feel about these things. It's not exactly how we'd see them, but that's how they saw it. With the birth of a son to Ruth, by virtue of the kinsman, Boaz, that meant that now there were descendants. Excuse me. There were descendants of Elimelech. There were descendants of Mahlon. And the line would continue, and they wouldn't disappear. This was full restoration. This is what happens after redemption. That's the purpose of redemption, to bring about restoration. According to the law, redemption, being redeemed, was not simply something that involved vengeance or involved, exacting vengeance against somebody who had done wrong. It might involve the payment of a fine, the payment of the equivalent, if an animal died because of an accident. Then redemption involved paying the cost of the animal from the person who caused the accident to the person who owned the animal. That's restoration. Now, in the case of crimes against people, personal crimes, obviously restoration is a much more complicated process. The mere exchange of payment can't make that happen. They recognized that in ancient Israel just as much as we did, but if they had the law. The payment of a fine or a price, that was the only tool they had. They had to do it even though it didn't make up for what was lost, because that's all they had. Our own legal remedies when a crime is committed, when a property crime is committed, payment can make restitution, or can bring redemption, bring restoration. If somebody steals something from me, well, if it's recovered when they're arrested, that item will be returned to me. It'll be restored to me. And that'll be, in essence, the act of redemption and restoration as carried out by our current law. However, if the crime they commit against me is not one of theft, where they don't take property, but it's one of injury to me or of personal loss to me, well, they might pay a fine. They might pay a fine to the state. They might pay restitution to me, but it doesn't really restore. Restoration is going to have to happen through another venue. In this case, it was the birth of Obed. Obed restored Naomi. She had been redeemed when her daughter-in-law Ruth married Boaz, and thus gained for them a place. They weren't going to starve now. They would have a place to live. They would have a home. They would have people. They would have everything they needed in order to avoid the problems that they were facing when they first came back from Moab, of being two women without a means of earning a living and without resources. So that's been accomplished. But the restoration that Naomi still needed to deal with the emptiness and bitterness that the loss of her husband and sons, the loss of the future that the death of her husbands and sons had brought about, that was only accomplished with the birth of Obed. He restored Naomi. That's one of the reasons why she receives him with such joy. That's one of the reasons why we're told they lay him at her breast and she becomes his nurse. They don't mean that she became like the wet nurse, where actually women in that culture frequently did so. And in tribal cultures today, might help the mother out if she can't nurse her child. Other women who are nursing might help her out and help the child out in that case. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about a word that describes assurance, it describes trust and belief. In the same way that Obed restored Naomi, Naomi would now be the source of assurance, the source of trust, the source of belief. She would be the reason that Obed would have to know about the family history, to know about the the family of Elimelech, the family of which he was legally heir, even though he was biologically the heir and the son of Boaz. She'd be the way by which he'd know that. And so they describe that close relationship that's going to develop, that would develop over time between Obed and the woman who was legally his grandmother, and who probably would have been called Nana or Grandma or whatever other word would have been used in Hebrew at the time anyway, simply because of Ruth's close relationship with her, but it's a legal description in their sense. And so she's restored. Jesus' purpose in redeeming us is restoration. That's his ultimate goal. It's not simply to redeem us and change us from people who were sinners into people who are not sinners. To change us from people who were not saved into people who are saved. If that's the only change that's made, if the only thing that changes is the label, well, that's not really much of a change at all, is it? I mean, don't we know of people who would probably very easily meet the criteria that would say they named Jesus as Lord. They've invited him into their lives. They acknowledge him as Lord and acknowledge him as the Lord of their lives, who are yet still jerks. It's possible, isn't it, to meet people who have been saved by Jesus, but who still act like jerks sometimes. When I said this Sunday morning with the congregation, there was a little bit of laughter around the sanctuary, because I think probably nearly everybody in the sanctuary has once upon a time met somebody like that. And I said, maybe we've even been somebody like that, right? The truth is that simple change of status from unsaved to saved, that's not Jesus' whole purpose. His whole purpose was not simply redemption, but restoration. That we would be restored. The image of God in us would be restored, and we would be restored to more and more like the people that God always intended us to be. That God's grace, having changed us, having brought about the change in us from, and justified us, that's the word we use, from unsaved to saved, would now bring about, will now bring about, our restoration, our growth in faith, our growth in grace, our growth in living the life that God calls us to live. That's what will happen as we go forward. That's what will happen as we manage to, well, it's actually not us managing it, it's God working in us, but you get the point. As we receive God's grace so as to grow in the faith and grow in grace and grow in our abilities, grow in our allegiance, grow in our dedication to following Jesus. Restoration is God's goal. And when we think about it, it's ours too. Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians. Peace, joy, self-control, all those things. Those happen as a growth of the Spirit within us, as a part of our restoration. We don't make them happen, but God working in us as we allow him to work in us brings them about. They're fruit, remember? And fruit comes from the tree, not because the tree wills it, but because that's what the tree does. The tree just makes fruit. The peach tree doesn't decide, I will have peaches. The peach tree has peaches because peach trees have peaches. And so that fruit grows in us as a product of restoration. That was Jesus' ultimate goal. Redemption is the first step. It's the necessary step. It's the one we can't do on our own in any way, shape, or form. The subsequent steps, the restoration, the growth in grace, what we in Methodism call sanctification, that happens as a cooperative effort between us and God. God's grace at work in us, and us seeking that grace, trying to open avenues for that grace to be at work in our lives and allowing it to transform us. The ultimate goal of redemption is restoration. The ultimate goal of the redemption of Ruth and Naomi was the restoration of the family, the restoration of the household. It happened through the creation of the household of Ruth and Boaz and little Obed. And in so doing, it restored the household of Elimelech and Naomi and Mahlon and Ruth again. That was the goal. That is still Jesus' goal today. It's what he calls us to do in our own lives It's what He calls us to help each other do in each other's lives. It's what He calls us to move forward towards as we grow in grace and grow in faith. Thanks for listening. I'm hoping this live feed works. I see that there are some comments that show up down there at the bottom of the screen. I can't read them because it's too far away, but I can see that there are some. So I know the feed is out there. And hopefully when I post, the feed will post on our church Facebook page, and we'll get that to work. Still trying to figure out why it's not working earlier, what our problem has been. Just not showing up. I'm not sure what the deal is, but anyway, we managed this, so able to share with you in some ways. I'll go ahead and put this video together and put it on our church YouTube channel so that we will have this this message available for folks to share, even if they don't get to share the whole worship service. Thanks for watching. Make a quick plug for the Word All Week devotion that will post each morning on our church Facebook page. A quick question, a quick thought for you to do if you're having your own quiet time or devotion in the morning that you can listen to, take a look at, and then have whatever devotion or quiet time you do, and then go on about your day. So, anyway, again, thank you for sharing. Sorry about all the issues that we're having. Perhaps a more tech-savvy person would be able to figure that out. But in the meantime, it's me, so I'll be doing the best I can. I do appreciate you listening and watching. I do appreciate all the support that you guys show us on our Facebook page, all those folks from near and far who post on it, who comment on it, who give us likes, who do all those things. I'm very grateful for you staying connected to us through that page, and pray for you that you may be blessed by God as He works in your life this week. Thanks a lot. God bless.